In today's lecture, we're going to be examining Chapter 10 of the text, looking specifically at force and coercion as elements of police misconduct, but also their operational position in police practices. So, sort of contextualize how frequency force is used on individuals. Arrests are made in about around 5% of police interactions, and in about half of those interactions, the people being arrested in verbally or physically, most commonly verbally, challenge the police's authority in some way. It's no surprise that people don't like to be arrested. If you've ever seen the show Cops, it's usually not a very nice experience for the person being arrested, the police officer. It's just not a fun type of social interaction. Um, Overall, we see about 2% of instances of force taking place in these interactions. Um, Less for serious types of force being used. Lethal force is extremely rare, although it is highlighted very heavily because of the seriousness that goes with it. But there are millions of police interactions every year, hundreds of thousands of arrests for felony charges, and very few of those instances result in lethal force being used. There's a couple types of um, verbiage that police can use. First is definitional, just trying to figure out, asking questions, what happened in a particular situation. The next is imperative, where they are giving lawful commands. And then last is coercive, which is do this or else. We'll look specifically at the force continuum in a couple slides, but these are just some of the these are three types of communications that have been defined relative to police behavior. So that continuum of force that I mentioned briefly in the last slide is laid out here. This is how they teach police officers types of force to use, when to use them, and to start with as little as possible force before moving into the later stages. The first is just the mere presence of an officer. This is the reason why places like Quick Trip, other establishments like that, will give officers free coffee, free donuts if they want to sit in the parking lot for a while. Most people aren't stupid enough to try to commit a criminal act when a police officer is there. Many criminals are smart enough to watch an area and see if the police officers leave before committing a criminal act. But for the most part, most criminals that are actually going through any type of a decision-making process aren't going to commit a criminal act with a police officer in clear view. The next is verbalization, and we talked about those types of different levels of talking basically in the previous slide, but it's broken down into two levels here. Verbalization is basically asking things, and then the next command is telling. So if the asking wasn't followed, then the telling happens. If the telling is still not working, the first level of physical force is what's known as a firm grip, which is typically going to be on the arm. It's not like an arm lock, but it's basically just the officer putting a hand on a suspect, and that situation would more or less would be considered an arrest. If you are physically being held by an officer, you are effectively under arrest. Um, so that's it's important to note sort of where these things fall in. If that's not working, instead of putting a hand on the arm, they might go to an arm lock or something like that, some sort of pain compliance technique. And departments are getting more skilled and more diversified in what types of combat training they give their officers. So that could be fairly advanced, or it could be basic stuff. But again, just trying to get to have the officer's command basically be followed. If that's still not working, you have impact techniques, which are strikes, whether that's martial arts strikes, hand, foot, or whether that's using a baton, flashlight, something of that nature. And then also less lethal impact devices are in here as well, tasers, stun guns, things like that. Those are not as effective as you would think they would be, especially with suspects that potentially are intoxicated. Um, the tasers are not as effective. Also, if the person has been hit with a taser in the past, the first time you get hit with electricity, it's stunning and jarring, but after that, you kind of can recognize it and almost can play through the pain. So it's really it's not the best tool for police officers to rely on. Last is deadly force, which is basically dictated by what's known as the fleeing felon rule. In the past, that had been interpreted that anytime the police see a known fleeing felon, they can shoot to kill. The Supreme Court has said that is unconstitutional as far as cruel and unusual punishment. The modern interpretation of the fleeing felon rule is that if a felony suspect is fleeing and presenting a danger to the safety of the people around them, the officers, civilians, then the police can use deadly force, but only in circumstances where there is a threat of force being used against other individuals. And we've seen this sort of come up in a couple of high profile cases recently. A case in Chicago where a police officer was convicted of murder for shooting a suspect who was walking in the street with a knife. Um, we've seen the shooting that took place in Atlanta, where the individual had taken the taser from the police officer and was pointing it at the officer. That one is sort of yet to be decided in terms of legal issues associated with it as of October 26, 2020. But that's another one where there's other people around. The officers themselves are being faced with a threat of force there as well. There's varying interpretations of that in different cases, which is again why it's very important to look at these cases very individualistic before we start to try to group them together. Issues with force. Number one is the firearms. Firearms are what they're using for deadly force. You cannot realistically expect a police officer to shoot someone in the arm or leg. It's listed as deadly force because that's what it's intended to be used for. It's intended to end the suspect and end the threat they're presenting. I hear that a lot. That why can't they shoot to wound, shoot in the arm or the leg? And the people that say that more often than not have never shot a gun in their life. It's extremely difficult to shoot even shoot center mass like the police officers are taught. To try to shoot someone in the arm or the leg is much more difficult and much more likely to result in an unintended consequence, meaning someone behind the person getting shot. Even the nature of the ammunition that police officers use is such that it is supposed to not go through whatever it hits first. They use hollow points, which are, with the lecture here, I could have actually brought one and showed you guys what that looks like. But you can Google an image of a hollow point ammunition. The point is that it, instead of having a solid top like you would have on a normal round of ammunition, it's segmented so that when it hits a suspect, it does two things. It does one thing for two purposes. It breaks up, and that makes sure that it's not going to go through the person and hit someone behind, and it also has maximum stopping damage. So when police shoot, they shoot to kill. So the where they shoot is they're taught to shoot center mass and to shoot center mass, and then they're not taught to shoot headshots, but it's on the same line. And the number of times they shoot, they are taught to shoot until the threat is neutralized and not to stop until that happens. So if you have 16 rounds, 15 rounds in your clip, that's how many times you're going to shoot. And then you're going to reload, and while that's happening, you're going to assess the situation. The reason they're taught to do that is because again, it's deadly force. So once they're using that, that is the goal. The goal is to end the suspect. Um, it would be beneficial for the police if they were better trained in terms of when to use deadly force and when not to. But it's also part of that responsibility is on the community and not putting the police in situations where they're having to make those decisions. Um, and the police have seen more than really any other profession, they've seen the negative outcomes of not making those decisions quickly. While there are, hundreds, if not more than 1,000 people killed by police every year, the same number of police are killed each year. There are similar levels of death being visited upon the police as there are being visited upon the citizens. So it's something that's going to be take on from both sides to prevent these situations from happening in the future. It's going to take education, training, and really a change of behavior on both sides. I mean, one of the things too that's really just throwing for lack of a better term, a shit wrench into this whole situation is that we're asking the police to do something like fight the war on drugs, which is impossible. We talked about the corruption in the last chapter that affords the situation, all these drugs and cash and things like that. So we're asking them to go do an unfair task, which paints them in a negative eye in the community, which makes people disrespect their authority, which leads to more negative interactions. So as a society, we're asking police to do an impossible task and then holding them accountable inappropriately when they can't perform that task. And at the same time, that task they're being asked to do is reducing their legitimacy in the community. Something that we need to focus on instead of, you know, um, upping the war on drugs is de-escalation, both in individual circumstances, teaching the police how to do things like identify a mental health crisis and de-escalate that situation, but also de-escalating the militaristic style with which we are sending the police out there into our streets. The purpose of the police wearing blue over red in London in the 1820s was to delineate themselves from the military. And now we're putting these troop carriers and we're putting SWAT gear and tactical gear and tactical rifles, and the police look more like the military than ever. So they need to be trained more in de-escalation. We've also seen issues associated with specific implementation of weapons, using flashlights as opposed to batons. I don't know for sure, but it seems like that started with a department making people write reports if they used the batons, but not if they did the flashlights, and they started using the flashlights. And in most places either have formal policies saying that flashlights are not to be used as weapons, or that they're only supposed to be used as backup. So that's a strange one. One that was more even really more strange is the use of nunchucks, a weapon popularized by the Bruce Lee movie Game of Death. Also, Michelangelo, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I don't. Oh, I should have had one. I should have had one right where I could show them. But there was a department in California, and other departments have tried this in the past, wanted to use that weapon as an impact device. It can be used as an impact device. Its main purpose as a weapon is disarming. So it's basically two batons attached with a chain, and effective use of that weapon is to disarm someone. You can take away a knife. You could even take away a firearm if the officers were trained to do that. But the association with kung fu movies, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the citizens didn't like it. Didn't like the police having this this weapon that was associated with glorification of fighting, even though it is a fairly effective tool in being implemented in what it's for. There's also the issue of canine officers. Some departments have had a longer, more negative history of using canine officers on, particularly for non-white suspects. Los Angeles has a big problem with this, using canine officers on African American and Hispanic Latino suspects. So some places have a more negative history with this. Um, Areas in the South as well, with the usage of the police dogs during the civil rights movement. But they are effective in getting in places that are dangerous or where a human officer can't go, underneath a house, um, things like that. And also, not that it's not to minimize the loss of a canine officer, but it's better than a human officer dying. Not that they're bullet shields. They're animals that are, that feel pain, and in these cases are very highly trained and, expensive, if nothing else. So it's not that we want to use them as bullet shields, but they are effective in finding suspects, in even finding potential victims. Um, so they can be very effective in proper operation, but there have been areas in the past where the dogs have been used in inappropriate manners. So here we have the big delineation, and this is the probably the most important part of our study of the use of force of police officers, is the difference between excessive force and police brutality. Right? Police brutality is an intentional misdeed. So the police officer, whatever they did, whatever their action was, it was intentional, and it was intended to serve an illegal purpose. Excessive force means that more force was potentially used than could have been used to satisfy a situation. We typically do not see use of force as police misconduct or deviance, as long as it's within a reasonable realm. So that continuum, as long as it's within like one level, and it's not killing someone when that is not warranted. The reason that police officers will use more force than what is needed is that if they don't use enough, bad things have happened. The officers' weapons have been taken from them. Other people have gotten hurt. So that's the main goal. The main goal is to stop the situation that's happening. And the order that the officers are worried about is, number one, innocent bystanders. Anyone that is unintentionally in this situation or is in the situation through no wrongdoing of their own. Number two is the other officers around them, and then themselves. So they're worried about them. And then number three, they're worried about the safety of the suspect, because a lot of times suspects are altered on substances or having mental health issues, and they need someone to basically look out for their interests as well, and try to care for them in these, high stress, dangerous situations. But that's always going to be third, after the innocent civilians and the police officers themselves. So they're going to use more force than potentially needed when we look back at a situation in hindsight to try to maintain the safety of the first two groups of people. Another issue with this is cameras. And any police officer that doesn't want to wear a camera, bye. They can get out of here. We don't need them, don't want them, can't work with them. There's no reason why a police officer shouldn't wear a camera, and that camera shouldn't be on every second, as long as they're not in the bathroom using the facilities. The cameras do more to prevent frivolous claims against police officers than they do to expose this assumed high level of corruption that's taking place. When again, that's not the case. So the cameras are very important. They need to be on every officer and on at all times, so that we have an objective account of what happened in any situation. We don't want to rely on he said, she said, or whatever bullshit blue wall stuff comes up with, or whatever bullshit the community members come up with that the police officer did. I want an objective camera view of it. The great philosopher Marvin Gaye said, "Believe half of what you see and none of what you hear." Okay, I don't want accounts. I don't want secondhand accounts. I don't want rehearsed accounts. I want video from every angle of what happened, and I can make up my own decision at that point. I've never been on a jury on one of these cases. I'm not in a decision making position, but personally, I'm going to make up my own opinion about the cases based on the information that I can garner. The issue, though, with the uses, the implementation of the fleeing felon rule and defensive life standard is that police officers have seen, again, for lack of a better term, they've seen a lot of messed up stuff. Okay, they've seen situations devolve into violence at a higher rate than the average person. They have violent encounters at much higher rates than the average person, an average community member. So their perception of a situation going off the rails is different than the average person. So when they see someone and they're in a situation, they might have a different perception of that person's threat level than even the person themselves. The person themselves might not even see the threat potential that they're creating in the police officer's mind, and that has resulted in a lot of negative outcomes for these police citizen interactions. Um, Lastly, and I'm not putting this out there in reference to any particular case. Again, another thing I like to do in terms of forming my own opinion about these things is waiting until the criminal justice system has had its full course before really deciding on a situation, because a lot of times you're not going to get the whole of the information until that happens anyway. So when these incidents happen, it's extremely important not to try to just lump them in with other high profile incidents that have taken place. It's a logical fallacy, number one. Number two, it's if you have a case where a community member is at fault. Sorry, if you first you have a case where a police officer has done something wrong, and then a week later you have another negative interaction where the community member was at fault, and you try to lump those two together, you're weakening the case against the police in the first instance. Additionally, by having the level of attention that we've seen in some of these cases, you're really doing a disservice to the criminal justice process and the ability of a prosecutor to seek a conviction. If the prosecutor has to move the trial because of so the shooting in Atlanta is a good instance of that. They're probably going to have to move that case if they do proceed with the criminal charges, because we've had the riots, because we've had the arson, the Wendy's being burned to the ground. Those things are impacting the jury pool, and that's only going to help a defense attorney have their client be exonerated. So it's not going to help justice being served or being seeked. That's why it's very important, again, to look at these cases individually, let them run their course through the criminal justice system, and then once we have an actual outcome that society has, an outcome from the people that society, that government, that aspect, whether it's a city, a state, whatever, has decided to allow to make those decisions. Once we have that outcome, then we can gauge it. So, for instance, in the Breonna Taylor case, the prosecutor in the grand jury system, from what it seems that we've had from the transcript of the grand jury that's come out, the prosecutor intentionally tried to drive the grand jury away from any type of criminal charges against the police officers for directly related to the killing, so serious felony charges. That's a shitty situation, and the people that make those decisions need to be held to account for the situations that they made, situations that they create, with a higher frequency. So prosecutors, police officers, these individuals need to be held to account, but we need to make sure that we are holding the appropriate people to account for the appropriate measures, and sort of giving them the opportunity to make a better decision. So that prosecutor in Louisville made a decision to do what they did in terms of trying to steer the grand jury away from those serious charges. So now that they've been allowed to make their decision, they've had their discretionary decision. We can then grade that, and we can grade that as shitty. We can grade what they did and the way that they basically worked to cover up a what is now with the addition of the cover up is basically a murder. Um, Now we have a continuing problem instead of having a solution. Um, so it's something that we're going to have to basically re-examine and almost tear down and build up from the beginning in terms of our expectations of the police, what we want to have happen in these situations. Um, but that starts with looking at them individually and trying to um, seek these individual outcomes, and then sort of based on that figure out why that happened, and then how to change what we want to have changed in the future. But the only way we do that is by providing justice for the victims, for their co-victim family members, but also for the accused, because the system that we have in place for um, bringing charges against individuals, how serious we take that, and how thorough the process goes for the lowest among us, the person who receives the least justice. That's effectively the level that we can all expect. Even if we don't like what happened, if we don't like the outcome, the process and the system needs to be as fair as possible for an officer charged with shooting a community member or a community member charged with shooting an officer. And the only way that we do that is by, um, again, specifically identifying aspects that are problematic, and then try to fix those things on both sides. And first off, it just takes up standing up and admitting that both sides are at fault here. The police are at fault individually. The police systems are at fault. Community members are, in some of these instances, at fault. And the things that we are asking the police to do as a society are at fault. So those are the things that we need to look at and address going forward if we expect to see any major changes in the way that police are using force, and the way that they are held to account for the uses of that force.